What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors faces off against a late-night host who crossed every line imaginable? Tonight we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had security rushing to separate two grown men on live television. This isn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This is the moment Jimmy Kimmel's arrogance finally met its match in Denzel Washington's unwavering principles. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And what started as promotional appearance turned into a verbal battlefield that left the entire studio speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe how this all went down. The Late Late Show with Jimmy Kimmel was supposed to be just another stop on Denzel Washington's press tour. The Oscar-winning actor had agreed to appear on the show to promote his latest directorial project, a passion piece he'd been developing for over a decade. But from the moment Denzel walked onto that soundstage, something felt different. The usual pre-interview pleasantries were notably absent, and Jimmy's team seemed unusually tense as they went through the final preparations. "Denzel, great to have you here," Jimmy said as they settled into their chairs, but his tone carried an edge that seasoned television viewers would recognize immediately. "I've got to say, I'm really looking forward to this conversation." Denzel, ever the professional, smiled politely and adjusted his position in the guest chair. "Always a pleasure, Jimmy. Thanks for having me." But Jimmy wasn't interested in pleasantries. He leaned forward with that trademark smirk that had become his signature, the one that usually preceded his most controversial moments. "So, Denzel, I've been watching your career for decades now, and I have to ask, don't you think it's time you started taking on some roles that actually matter?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The studio audience, expecting the usual banter between host and guest, suddenly found themselves witnessing something far more uncomfortable. Denzel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but those who knew him well could see the storm clouds gathering behind his eyes. "Roles that matter?" Denzel repeated slowly, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm despite the obvious provocation. "Jimmy, I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at." Jimmy's grin widened, sensing what he mistakenly believed was vulnerability. "Come on, Denzel. You're one of the most talented actors of your generation, maybe of all time. But lately, it feels like you're just coasting, playing it safe. Where's the fire? Where's the passion we saw in your earlier work?" The accusation was as insulting as it was unfounded, and everyone in that studio knew it. Here was a man who had consistently chosen challenging, meaningful roles throughout his career, being accused of mediocrity by someone whose own career highlights included viral videos and celebrity pranks. Denzel took a deep breath, and those familiar with his interviews knew this was the moment he was choosing his words very carefully. "Jimmy, I appreciate your perspective, but I think you might be operating from some incomplete information. Every role I choose, every project I take on, it's because it speaks to something important. Whether that's exploring the human condition, telling stories that need to be told, or working with filmmakers who share a vision for meaningful cinema." But Jimmy wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed emboldened by what he perceived as a defensive response. "Meaningful cinema," he repeated with obvious mockery. "That's what we're calling it now? Look, I get it. Everyone wants to be taken seriously, but at some point, don't you think audiences deserve entertainment over lecture?" The insult was clear and deliberate. Jimmy was essentially accusing one of cinema's most respected artists of being preachy and out of touch with his audience. It was the kind of comment that might slide by with a lesser guest, someone more concerned with maintaining their public image than standing up for their principles. But Denzel Washington was not that kind of man. "Entertainment over lecture," Denzel said, his voice still controlled but with an unmistakable undercurrent of steel. "Jimmy, let me ask you something. When you wake up in the morning, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see someone who's contributing something positive to the world, or do you see someone who's just taking up space?" The question caught Jimmy off guard. This wasn't how these interviews typically went. Guests were supposed to play along with his provocations, laugh at his jokes, maybe push back playfully, but ultimately submit to his role as the host in control. "I see someone who entertains millions of people every night," Jimmy replied, but there was less confidence in his voice now. "Someone who brings joy and laughter into people's lives." Denzel nodded slowly as if considering this response. "Joy and laughter. That's important. I won't disagree with that. But Jimmy, there's a difference between bringing joy and simply distracting people from the things that matter. There's a difference between making people laugh with you and making them laugh at others." The observation was surgical in its precision. Jimmy's comedy often relied on mocking others, whether celebrities, politicians, or ordinary people caught in embarrassing situations. It was the kind of humor that punched down rather than up, and Denzel had just called it out in front of a live audience. Jimmy's face flushed slightly, and the mask of professional congeniality began to slip. That's rich coming from someone who's made a career out of playing the same character over and over again. "Tell me, Denzel, how many times can you play the angry black man before audiences get tired of it?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze in place, unsure whether they should continue rolling or cut to commercial. Jimmy had just crossed a line that no professional broadcaster should ever approach, let alone leap over with such obvious malice. Denzel's response was immediate and devastating in its quiet intensity. "The angry black man," he repeated, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Jimmy, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because this is important. The characters I play, they're not angry without cause. They're responding to injustice, to systems that devalue human dignity, to people who think they can say whatever they want without consequences." He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on Jimmy's with an intensity that made the host visibly uncomfortable. "You want to talk about anger? Let's talk about the kind of anger that comes from watching someone use their platform to tear others down instead of building them up. Let's talk about the anger that comes from watching privilege masquerade as wit." Jimmy tried to regain control of the situation, but his usual arsenal of deflection tactics seemed woefully inadequate against Denzel's measured fury. "Look, I think you're taking this a little too seriously. This is just television, Denzel. We're just having a conversation." "Just television," Denzel repeated, and there was something almost pitying in his tone now. "Jimmy, do you have any idea how many people are watching us right now? Do you understand the responsibility that comes with having this kind of reach, this kind of influence?" The host shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly aware that he was no longer in control of his own show. "Of course I understand responsibility. I've been doing this for years." "Years of what, exactly?" Denzel asked, and the question carried the weight of genuine curiosity mixed with barely contained disgust. "Years of making jokes at other people's, expense? Years of reducing complex human beings to punchlines? Years of using your platform to punch down instead of up?" Jimmy's face was now visibly red, and the cocky smirk that had started this whole confrontation was nowhere to be seen. "I think you're being a little unfair here. Comedy has always pushed boundaries. That's what makes it funny." "Boundaries," Denzel said, and he actually chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. "Jimmy, there's a difference between pushing boundaries and obliterating basic human decency. There's a difference between being provocative and being cruel." The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by this verbal dismantling happening in real time. This wasn't the sanitized conflict they were used to seeing on late-night television. This was raw, unfiltered, and absolutely devastating. Jimmy tried one more time to assert his authority as the host. "You know what, Denzel? I think maybe you should consider that not everything is about you. Not every joke, not every comment, not every observation is a personal attack on your character or your race." It was perhaps the worst thing he could have said. Denzel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. "My race," Denzel said quietly. "There it is. The thing you've been dancing around this entire interview. You want to make this about race because it's easier than acknowledging that this is about character. This is about the kind of person you choose to be when the cameras are rolling." Jimmy realized he'd made a critical error, but instead of backing down, he doubled down with the desperation of someone who knew he was losing badly. "I'm not making anything about race. You're the one who brought up playing angry black characters." "No, Jimmy. You brought that up. You reduced decades of nuanced performances, characters who fight against injustice and stand up for what's right, to a racial stereotype. And you did it because you thought it would be funny. You thought your audience would laugh at the idea of the angry black man." The accusation hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Jimmy looked around desperately, as if hoping his producers might cut to commercial, or that someone might rescue him from this increasingly uncomfortable situation. "That's not what I meant," he stammered, but even he seemed to know how weak his defense sounded. "Then what did you mean?" Denzel asked, and his voice was absolutely calm now, which somehow made it even more terrifying. "Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you thought you could use lazy racial stereotypes to get a cheap laugh at my expense." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but Denzel wasn't finished. "Let me tell you something about those characters you want to dismiss so casually. Malcolm X wasn't angry without cause. He was angry about systematic oppression. Frank Lucas in American Gangster wasn't angry without cause. He was responding to limited opportunities in a society that didn't value his humanity. Alonzo in Training Day, yes, he was angry, but that anger came from years of seeing the system fail the communities he was supposed to protect. The passion in Denzel's voice was building now, and it was clear that this wasn't just about defending his career choices. This was about defending the very idea that art should have meaning, that stories should have purpose. These aren't just roles, Jimmy. They're explorations of the human experience. They're attempts to understand how good people can make bad choices, how systems can corrupt individuals, how hope can survive in the darkest circumstances. Jimmy looked like a man who had walked into what he thought was a puddle, only to discover it was actually quicksand. "I think maybe we should move on to talking about your new project." "Oh no," Denzel said, and there was steel in his voice now. "We're not moving on. You wanted to have this conversation, so let's have it. You want to talk about entertainment versus lecture? Let's talk about the difference between entertainment that challenges people to think and entertainment that encourages them to stop thinking." The host was visibly sweating now, and his usual confident demeanor had completely evaporated. "Denzel, I think you're reading way too much into what was meant to be a light-hearted exchange." "Light-hearted," Denzel repeated, and he shook his head in apparent disbelief. "Jimmy, when you dismiss an actor's entire body of work as playing the same character over and over, when you reduce complex narratives to racial stereotypes, when you suggest that meaningful art is somehow less valuable than mindless entertainment, that's not light-hearted. That's destructive." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Jimmy looked to his producers off-camera, clearly hoping for some kind of intervention, but they seemed as frozen as everyone else in the studio. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Denzel continued, his voice softer now but no less intense. "You have this incredible platform. You reach millions of people every single night. You could use that influence to elevate voices that need to be heard, to shine light on stories that need to be told, to bring people together instead of driving them apart." He paused, looking directly at Jimmy with what could only be described as profound disappointment. "Instead, you choose to use it to tear people down. You choose to make jokes at the expense of others rather than finding humor that brings joy without causing pain. You choose to perpetuate stereotypes rather than challenging them." Jimmy's face had gone from red to pale, and beads of sweat were visible on his forehead under the studio lights. He was a man drowning in his own show, and his desperation was becoming more apparent with each passing second. "Look, I think we've gotten a little off track here," Jimmy said, his voice cracking slightly. "Maybe we should just agree to disagree and talk about something else." Denzel tilted his head slightly, studying Jimmy with the kind of intense focus he brought to his most challenging roles. "Agree to disagree about what exactly, Jimmy? About whether human dignity matters? About whether your platform comes with responsibility? About whether perpetuating harmful stereotypes is acceptable, as long as it gets a laugh?" The questions hit like hammer blows, each one stripping away another layer of Jimmy's carefully constructed television persona. The confident, wise-cracking host was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "You're putting words in my mouth," Jimmy protested weakly. "I never said anything about human dignity." "You didn't have to say it," Denzel replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Your actions spoke for you. The moment you decided to reduce my life's work to a racial caricature, you made a statement about what you think of human dignity. The moment you suggested that meaningful art is less valuable than empty entertainment, you revealed your priorities." Jimmy looked toward his producers again, and this time his desperation was unmistakable. He was silently pleading for someone to save him from this public dismantling, but no help was coming. His team seemed as transfixed by the spectacle as the studio audience. "I think you're being incredibly unfair," Jimmy said, and there was a whining quality to his voice now that made him sound like a petulant child. "I was just trying to have a fun conversation." "Fun for who?" Denzel asked, and the question was delivered with surgical precision. "Fun for you? Fun for your audience who gets to watch you tear down someone they respect? Fun for the millions of viewers who are supposed to laugh along with your casual racism?" The accusation of racism hung in the air like a death sentence. Jimmy's eyes went wide, and he suddenly looked like a man who realized he had wandered into a minefield. "That's not fair," he said, but his voice was barely above a whisper now. "I'm not racist. I would never— I have friends who are—" "Stop," Denzel said, and the single word carried such authority that Jimmy immediately fell silent. "Just stop. Don't make this worse for yourself by trotting out tired excuses. Don't insult both of our intelligence by pretending that having diverse friends somehow excuses perpetuating harmful stereotypes on national television." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras, the soft whisper of the air conditioning, the nervous shifting of audience members who had come expecting comedy, and instead found themselves witnessing a masterclass in moral courage. "Here's what I want you to understand, Jimmy," Denzel continued, leaning forward slightly. "When you use your platform to diminish others, when you choose mockery over respect, when you prioritize cheap laughs over human dignity, you're not just entertaining people. You're teaching them. You're showing them that it's acceptable to treat others as less than human, as long as it gets a reaction." Jimmy tried one last desperate gambit to regain control of the situation. "You know what, Denzel? I think maybe you should remember that you're a guest on my show. I invited you here, and I can uninvite you just as easily." It was the wrong thing to say. Completely, catastrophically wrong. Denzel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that somehow made him seem to tower over Jimmy despite both men being seated. "Your show," Denzel said quietly. "That's what this is really about, isn't it? Power, control, the ability to tear people down from your little throne and face no consequences because it's your show, your rules, your kingdom of manufactured cruelty." He stood up slowly, deliberately, and the simple action seemed to drain all the air from the room. "You want to uninvite me, Jimmy? You want to exercise your power as the host? Go ahead. Kick me off your show. Show everyone watching exactly who you really are when someone challenges you to be better than your worst instincts." Jimmy's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had issued a threat expecting Denzel to back down, to apologize, to remember his place as a guest in Jimmy's domain. Instead, he found himself facing a man who was completely unafraid of the consequences of speaking truth. "I didn't mean—" Jimmy started, but Denzel cut him off with a gesture. "Yes, you did. You meant exactly what you said. You thought you could intimidate me into silence by threatening to remove me from your precious show. But here's what you don't understand, Jimmy. My dignity, my principles, my commitment to treating others with respect, those things aren't for sale. They're not negotiable, and they're certainly not worth sacrificing for a few minutes on your television program." The audience was completely captivated now, witnessing something they had never seen before. A guest who refused to be diminished by a host's power games. "You know what the saddest part of all this is?" Denzel asked, and his voice carried a note of genuine pity. "You could have been great. You have talent, you have charisma, you have access to incredible guests and amazing stories. But instead of using those gifts to elevate others, to bring out the best in people, to create something beautiful and meaningful, you choose to use them to tear people down." Jimmy looked like he was about to cry. The confident, irreverent comedian who had started this interview was completely gone, replaced by someone who seemed to finally understand the magnitude of his failure. "That's a choice, Jimmy. Every single day, every single show, every single interview, you make the choice between building up and tearing down, between respect and mockery, between elevating the conversation and dragging it into the gutter." Denzel turned to face the audience directly, his voice carrying easily through the silent studio. "And that choice, that daily decision about what kind of person you want to be, what kind of impact you want to have on the world, that's not just true for people with television shows. That's true for all of us. Every single day, we choose whether to add something positive to the world, or whether to just take up space." He turned back to Jimmy, who was now visibly shaking. "So yes, Jimmy, uninvite me. Kick me off your show, exercise your power, but understand that when you do, you're not just removing a guest who made you uncomfortable. You're showing everyone watching that when faced with a choice between growth and ego, between listening and lashing out, between being better and staying the same, you choose ego every single time." The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, Jimmy looked toward his producers and made a small gesture. Within seconds, security personnel appeared at the edge of the stage. "I think," Jimmy said, his voice barely audible, "we need to take a commercial break." But Denzel wasn't finished. As the security guards approached, he looked directly into the main camera and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. "Remember this moment," he said to the viewers at home. "Remember that you always have a choice. You can choose to be someone who builds others up or someone who tears them down. You can choose to use whatever platform you have, however small, to make the world a little bit better. The choice is always yours." The security guards reached him, but they hesitated, unsure whether they should actually remove someone who was speaking so calmly and powerfully about basic human decency. Jimmy finally found his voice. "Denzel Washington, everyone," he said, with forced cheerfulness that fooled absolutely no one. "Thank you for coming on the show." But as the guards finally began to escort Denzel toward the exit, his final words rang through the studio with crystal clarity. "The pleasure was all mine, Jimmy. I hope someday you remember this conversation and decide to be better." And with that, one of Hollywood's most respected actors was escorted off a late-night talk show for the crime of refusing to accept disrespect disguised as entertainment. What do you think about Denzel's refusal to back down in the face of Jimmy's power play? Was he right to stand his ground even when it meant getting kicked off the show? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. What would you have done in Denzel's position when faced with that kind of disrespect?